So to conclude this unit, we're going to talk about the 4 big ideas of AP Biology, and I wanted to address these now because we're going to reference them throughout the rest of the school year. So we need to develop a really good understanding of what these 4 big ideas mean. Now, about 3 years ago, when the curriculum for this course was altered, all of the concepts you were expected to know was organized into one of these 4 different ideas. And I found that the students that have a better understanding of the 4 big ideas are going to better answer the multiple choice questions and will be better able to come up with specific examples needed for short answer questions and essay questions that relate to the big ideas. Now, to help you keep examples of concepts in each unit related to these 4 big ideas, we're going to be completing this chart throughout the school year. So all we're going to focus on right now are these 4 top boxes that deal with the biochemistry unit. And what you should be able to do at the end of the lecture is give me 3 concepts related to biochemistry that relate to big idea 1, and 3 concepts for 2, 3, and 4. So let's take a second to give you a general overview of these big ideas. So big idea 1 states the process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life. So when we're talking about evolution, or we're talking about relatedness between organisms, then I'm giving you concepts to put in that first box under big idea 1 for that unit. In big idea 2, it states biological systems utilize free energy and molecular building blocks to grow, to reproduce, and to maintain homeostasis. So another way to read this is that biological systems need resources. Big idea 3 states that living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life processes. We see this in protein synthesis. We talked about DNA stores genetic information. It's retrieved by the mRNA. The mRNA takes it to a ribosome where it's transmitted, or it's translated into an amino acid sequence. So another way to say this concept is that organisms communicate. We're talking about communication. In this unit, we talked about receptor proteins on the membrane of a cell can bind a hormone, and that's a form of communication. When the cells receive that information, they can respond in some way. Big idea 4 states that biological systems interact, and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. So the key word is interact. In this unit, we talked about molecules interact. Phospholipids, cholesterol, proteins, they interact to form the cell membrane. In the next unit, we'll talk about organelles interact. And different cells in your body interact. And then in ecology, we talked about how organisms interact. So now that you've been introduced to these big ideas, let's relate them to concepts we learned in this biochemistry unit. So one concept under big idea 1 is that organisms share many conserved core processes and features that evolved and are widely distributed among organisms today. So let's talk about some common features that we discussed in this biochemistry unit. I mentioned that all organisms contain DNA. The fact that all organisms have this molecule in common allows us to utilize it so we can determine how related organisms are. To use DNA in this manner, we have to sequence it. We can sequence DNA, which means determine the order of bases, and we can compare the order of bases from one organism to the next and see how related they are to one another. Another commonality between all organisms are some proteins, like cytochrome C. Since all organisms have this molecule in common, we can sequence the amino acids to determine genetic relatedness. The more similar the sequence of amino acids between 2 different organisms, the more related they're going to be. Some other features that we talked about is that all organisms utilize the same 20 different amino acids. All organisms utilize the same 4 types of organic molecules: proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids. We can add an additional bullet. All organisms are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. All organisms contain molecules that are based on carbon. So there's lots of ideas related to this unit that we can also relate to evolution. Now, these bullets that I just went over might be new concepts to you. This is really the first time that I addressed evolution in this biochemistry unit. But the rest of these ideas, from big idea 2 down, are all concepts that you should be able to recall, that we've talked about them in a previous lecture. So if I'm going through a bullet and that's new information to you, it indicates that you might need to go back and find that lecture so that you can review that information again, because it didn't stick with you the first time. So for big idea 2, that organisms need energy and they need resources to grow, reproduce, and maintain homeostasis. We talked about ATP is the molecule that provides free energy for reactions. That free energy is needed for reactions to take place, and that energy is called activation energy. Organisms need to acquire elements from the environment, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, so they can build their molecules, so they can grow. We addressed homeostasis, and that pH and temperature have to be held at ideal levels so that proteins will function normally. And then we also talked about negative feedback is a way that organisms can help maintain homeostasis and keep certain levels of molecules constant. For big idea 3, living systems store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information essential to life processes. Think of molecules that we talked about related to protein synthesis. We said DNA stores genetic information. RNA molecules retrieve that. We talked about receptor proteins are binding to hormones, causing the cell to respond. We talked about a secondary messenger that can be activated when a hormone binds to receptor protein, and that secondary messenger is called cyclic AMP. So those are some ideas in this unit that relate back to big idea 3. So let's take a look at big idea 4. That there's interactions. We see that water interacts with other molecules, and that helps these molecules form into different cellular structures, like the cell membrane. We talked about the different properties of R groups, and different R groups will interact with other ones to help that protein form that 3D structure so it can function. We talked about enzymes will interact to or bind with substrates or reactants to form products. But in addition, sometimes enzymes need the assistance of coenzymes and cofactors so they can bind to these substrates. And then we talked about there's other molecules that interact with enzymes, these competitive and these non-competitive inhibitors. These last 2 bullets I'm going to address further on the next page, but let me just read through them real quick. Variation of molecules provides a wider range of functions, and interactions among parts of a system lead to emergent properties. So let's go ahead and move down to the next page. And I'll further explain this idea of emergent properties and variation leading to robustness. Now, the first part of this box contains text that's right out of the AP course description. So pause and take a second to read through these statements and try to get an idea of what they're suggesting. Sometimes it's hard for students to understand some of these statements from the course description guide. So I've summarized it to make it a little bit easier for you to understand what they're trying to say. So think of it like this. The properties of individual parts are different from the properties of the whole. New properties will emerge when parts interact. These new properties that emerge are what we call emergent properties. So let's use water as an example. We know that water and other molecules are made of parts, are made of atoms. So let's label this the parts. And these parts come together to form the molecule. So the molecule is the whole. So let's look at the properties of these atoms. We know hydrogen is very reactant because it needs to get rid of 1 valence electron. Oxygen is also very reactive because it needs 2 valence electrons. So those are some properties of the individual atoms. When they come together to form the whole, to form the water molecule, that water molecule has properties that are completely different from the parts. So it's like these properties emerge in the whole. So some properties of water we discussed is water is polar. It can form hydrogen bonds with other molecules, other polar molecules. It repels nonpolar molecules, and it's not highly reactive. So again, If you look at these properties of the whole, you're going to see that these properties are not found in the individual parts. And these properties only emerge by the interaction of these individual parts. Now let's look at a second example. So again, we're looking at how parts have different properties than the whole. But it takes the interaction of these parts to develop these new emergent properties. So we know the cell membrane is made of parts. It's made of phospholipids, cholesterol molecules, and proteins, and they all have their individual properties. When they come together, they form the cell membrane, and that cell membrane has different properties. So one property is that it's fluid in nature. Another property is it's a semi-permeable barrier. So these two properties are not properties that you find in the parts. A phospholipid itself is not a semi-permeable barrier. These properties emerge only when you get the interaction between these individual molecules or these parts. Now let's talk about the idea of robustness. Again, robustness relates to big idea 4. The first few sentences included here are straight from the AP course description guide. So take a second to pause and read through those, and then we'll break it down into simpler terms. To summarize, this is what these statements are saying. Variation will provide a wider range of functions. Now, we can relate robustness to many units. So I want you to think of what is the main idea that you're studying in this unit, and whatever that idea is, you're going to put it in this blank. In the biochemistry unit, we're studying molecules. So put molecules in that blank. Variation in molecules will provide a wider range of functions. In the next unit, we're going to be talking about cell structures. So variation in cell structures will provide a wider range of functions. So you'll be able to relate robustness to every unit that we're studying. But let's go ahead and fill this in for this unit. Variation in molecules will provide a wider range of functions. So here's a couple examples. First, we discussed that there's variations in RNA. There's 4 types: messenger RNA, ribosomal RNA, transfer RNA, and RNAi. And the I stands for interference. Each one of these different molecules performs a different task for the cell. If a cell didn't have each of these 4 types of RNA molecules, it wouldn't be able to function as efficiently as a cell that does. A cell that has these 4 different types will be able to respond better to changes in the environment. And that is what we mean by robustness, having a greater flexibility to respond to changes in the environment. We addressed this concept in pre-AP, but we just didn't use the term robustness. In ecology, we talked about if there's variation in populations, then those populations are more likely to survive a change in environment. So those populations would be more robust. Let's take a look at a second example related to the molecular level. All organisms have DNA, but there's variation in DNA. Let's just focus on variation in DNA between organisms of the same species. Because DNA varies, then organisms are going to produce different proteins. And sometimes some organisms aren't going to produce certain proteins at all because of the variations in DNA. So here's an example where an organism has a variation, and this variation is going to help this organism be more flexible, be more robust, be better able to survive a change in environment. The human population can be infected by the HIV virus. And this diagram is showing you how that virus gains access to your cells. This virus has to hook on to 2 different proteins. So here's the name of one protein, here's the name of the other protein. It's not important that you have them memorized, but it's important that you can look at this diagram and understand what's going on. Here is the HIV virus, and you can see that it's attached to this receptor protein, and in the second part, it's also attached to this receptor protein. And once it attaches to both of these proteins, then that tricks the cell to bring the HIV virus inside. Some individuals that have variation in their DNA do not produce this second protein. And that's what this bottom diagram is showing you. So here's a person's cell, and you can see that they're missing the second protein. So the HIV virus is not able to bind to these 2 receptors and get inside of a person's cell. So the HIV virus is not able to bind to both of these proteins and gain access to this person's cell. So this is an example where variation leads to robustness, which is the greater chance of survival if there's a change in the environment. Now that we've gone through concepts in this unit related to each of the 4 big ideas, let's look at a multiple choice question and some short answer questions that pertain to these big ideas. Hit pause and read through the multiple choice question and the short answer question and think about how you would answer it. One change I want you to be aware of is that when they redesigned the test, they moved away from having students memorize trivial facts to writing questions about these big ideas. These big ideas are concepts that you can relate to many facets of biology. When I read this multiple choice question for the first time, this is how I approached it. When I encountered answer A, I realized that these terms will never be said in AP biology. You will never hear me say molecular weight of molecules or talk about them. With that in mind, I can cross through answer A. It's not a possible answer. Now I want you to hit pause and familiarize yourself again with B, C, and D. Which one of these 3 answers relates more to a big idea that we just discussed? I believe C in this case stands out, and that's the correct answer to this question. The short answer question that I'm showing you is an example of how this worksheet, the big idea worksheet, is going to be able to help you. So let's address the first bullet. Describe one type of molecular evidence that can be used to determine that fungi, plants, and animals are more related to protists than to bacteria. So think about those bullets that we talked about underneath big idea 1 related to biochemistry. And we said that all organisms have DNA and that it can be sequenced to determine relatedness. So this would be an example of something that you could write here to answer that first bullet. The second bullet says, describe one type of cellular evidence that can be used to determine that fungi, plants, and animals are more related to protists than to bacteria. Well, it's my hope that in May, when you're studying for the AP exam, you can pull out this big idea sheet and you can go through some of these concepts that you have in the box. And the answer to that second bullet is going to be right here in this box. You're going to have a concept there that you can utilize to answer that second question that I showed you. Let me take a second to get rid of this writing. We need you to have a really good understanding of these big ideas and concepts from each unit that relates to each of these big ideas. As the year goes on and you develop a better understanding of these 4 ideas, you're going to be able to list any concept from a unit and say, this relates back to big idea 2, or this concept has to do with big idea 4. So we're going to start doing that with the biochemistry unit. And I want to fill in one box as an example so that you have an understanding of how you're going to complete the rest of the boxes for the biochemistry unit. Again, I want you to be able to indicate 3 concepts related from this unit that relates to each of the big ideas. Now, the 3 concepts that you list in each box need to be concepts that you're very comfortable with, that you can recall them and that you can explain more or give details about these ideas. So we're going to go back to the section in our notes where these concepts were listed for the biochemistry unit. Now I'm going to read through these 3 bullet points and I'm going to pick 3 that I feel the most comfortable with explaining. For me, I think it's very easy to remember that all organisms contain DNA. So I'm going to mention that in this first box. And I'm going to relate that to the idea of evolution, because that's the concept behind big idea number 1. Now, I understand these are tiny boxes, so we're going to paraphrase these statements, but we're going to give enough information that in May, when you're looking at this statement, you have an idea of how this concept in biochemistry is related to evolution. So with as little words as possible, I'm going to write sequencing DNA indicates relatedness. Now, I'm choosing to write this in this box for two reasons. One, this is a fact that's easy for me to recall, and I can also add to this idea. I know that if we sequence the DNA, and the DNA between two organisms is very similar in base sequences, then that indicates that these organisms are more related, or there's a very recent common ancestor between the two. A second idea I'm going to put in there is sequencing cytochrome C. And again, I'm putting this in here because this is easy for me to remember and because I can further explain it. If you can't give me additional information about cytochrome C, then this isn't something that you should probably put in this first box. But I know that cytochrome C is a protein that's found in the electron transport chain of all living things, and that I can sequence the amino acids, and the more similar amino acid sequence are between organisms, the more related they are. Another idea that I can add is all organisms, and since I'm running out of room, I'm going to put just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And that's all I'm going to write there. But in May, I need to be able to look back at that statement and understand that I'm trying to remind myself that all organisms utilize carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen to make up the molecules of living things. And so since all organisms have that feature in common, it indicates a common ancestor. Now what I want you to do is I want you to go back to this page in your notes, and I want you to start here with big idea 2. And I want you to read through the bullets and determine which bullets are easy for you to remember and explain. Pick 3 and add them to the boxes for each of these big ideas. We want to make sure that in May you can refer to this document and you can get a lot of ideas of concepts you can write about for each of these big ideas if you're asked to do so on a short answer or an essay question. In addition, if you're having a difficult time coming up with 3 ideas for each one of these boxes, you can refer back to your learning targets for this unit, and that's what this first page is addressing. I'm giving you some ideas related to this unit that go with each of these big ideas.